Also, in a way, I guess the other end of the scale when it comes to data protection and privacy of the subject and the consent forms. So also relating to what we talked about this morning. I'm very glad that for the first time we have Dirk Ostwald here contributing to the program, lecturing on this topic. Dirk did his PhD in Birmingham in neuroscience, I guess. Yeah. Having previously studied preclinical medicine, neuroscience, and mathematics. And he's also an alumnus of the BCCN, where he stayed as a researcher from 2010 to 14, after which, at least that's what it says here, after which he moved to the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, and since 2014 he's also assistant professor at the FU Berlin. And so we're looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, everybody in the back can hear me. Good. I should notify you that I'm recording this talk because I like to these days and then put it online. If you don't like that, tell me now, but I don't think, I mean, you can leave them. So, yeah, open cognitive neuroimaging. So where does that come from, and why am I talking about this? So the background to this is actually my personal experience when reading cognitive neuroimaging papers and also discussing cognitive neuroimaging projects with colleagues, that I was always a little bit disappointed that when I read a paper that I cannot basically work with the data myself, maybe verify the analysis or change something in the analysis to get a new result, because these data are somehow not available. And when I then talk to colleagues and say, well, we should make our data more available and share it, then what I always got as kind of an argument against that, my personal perception by people who don't really like to share their data, these people then usually said, well, this cannot be done because of data protection issues. And this is an argument, and I could never really argue against it because I just didn't know anything about data protection. So of course you can talk to your data protection officer, but these people also have kind of their agenda, so they really want to protect data. So basically then trying to increase data sharing in cognitive neuroimaging, and especially also being on some kind of ethical and legal appropriate basis for sharing the data that we acquire in the lab. I started this project, and I think I wouldn't have started this project or actually engaged a lot with that if there wasn't something to gain. So actually I submitted a proposal to this Open Science Fellows Program, which is funded by Wikimedia, the Stifterverband and Volkswagen Stiftung. They like the idea of looking into how you can share cognitive neuroimaging data and still respect data protection issues. So they liked it. So since last autumn, I'm in this group of open science activists who look into all various kinds of things across all disciplines in open science. And I'm not doing this project alone, so I have help from one of my colleagues, Elena Pavlenko, who's a SCAN student, so at Freie Universität Berlin, and she's actually doing this as her master thesis, and I also contribute. So before I go on and tell you what I want to discuss and what we want to discuss, first a disclaimer, because there will be some legal issues touched upon. but you should not rely on that. So I'm telling you, the content of this talk does not provide legal advice. The material has been prepared for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide legal advice. You should consult your own legal advisors and data protection officers before engaging in any sharing of sensitive personal data. So I made you aware of that. Actually, as we learned last Friday when we went to a Wikimedia workshop, because I'm not a law person, because I didn't study law, I don't have to give you that disclaimer. So if you, based on what I tell you, do something, I will not be punished or something because I don't know anything about this anyway. So I'm a lay person in law. But lawyers, for example, Martin Hase, as you heard this morning, they are actually accountable. I don't know whether this was discussed this morning. Okay. So that's the outline for the talk. So I first want to tell you explicitly what I mean by this term open cognitive neuroimaging, because that as soon as you say that sharing data, everybody seems to have, and that's very natural, everybody has their own idea of what is meant by that. And to clarify actually what I mean and what we mean in this project, first a little bit about cognitive neuroimaging, then on the legal aspects of data protection. So this will basically go maybe a little bit deeper and maybe a little bit more applied than what you heard this morning on data protection. And then actually, I think already the discussion bit starts. So we have now come up and proposed three, or discussed, and we don't propose them, they are there already in part. So we discussed three different models for open cognitive neuroimaging. And there I'm interested in what you also think, and how what you think is beneficial for science, but also for data protection. Then I might show you an example of what we are currently doing in this regard, and more discussion. So let's see whether this works. Before we start with the content, actually I want to learn a little bit more about you. And in the old days, I would have just asked you to raise your hand. But these days, it's an experiment. It's my first time using this. These days, I'm trying to use this. And it's kind of an exercise for later on when we will need this. So you should go to www.menti.com on your device. And then you should, it's not working that great. You should enter the code that you just saw, which you will see in a second again. It's fun. So, do you have the code? Do you have the question? Now click submit. So, there are 2 people, 3, and everybody's working in functional neuroimaging. That's amazing. So,
Do you count EG as neuroscience?
Sorry?
Do you count EG as neuroscience?
Yes. Yeah.
So if I enter the code again, the different question.
That's the second question, I guess. It's amazing. Okay, so basically I'm stopping this now here. So there's roughly, so there are some people working in functional neuroimaging, but it's half and half. So I think it makes sense that I talk a little bit about the functional neuroimaging that I'm doing. And actually I'm more interested also in the second slide. And that is the question whether you are aware of the open science movement. So just raise your hand if you're aware of the open science movement. Okay, that's also roughly half. Okay, good. Then I know what's going on, and we see that Menti is great. Maybe we use it later on, because that makes more sense. Here it didn't really make much sense. Okay, so what do I mean by open cognitive neuroimaging? And this is now in terms of the data sharing that I will talk about and what we should think about when thinking about the ethical and legal implications. So what I mean by cognitive neuroimaging is non-invasive, non-clinical imaging of the human brain using MRI, EEG, and MEG. That's what is in my mind currently cognitive neuroimaging. And the aim here is basic research, and the aim is to understand normal brain function. Yeah? So no clinical aspects whatsoever. So we are not trying to heal anyone directly with our work. So the components, so what does cognitive neuroimaging in my mind and in our project here comprise? Well, that's kind of the activities of designing experiments, collecting data using EEG, MRI, MEG, then analyzing the data, which is most of our work actually, and then writing scientific reports. So that's kind of the activities that the researcher goes through. And this happens in a number of disciplines, so it's not actually that I'm thinking in terms of a specific academic discipline, but I'm thinking in terms of cognitive neuroimaging as basic research across different disciplines like psychology, medicine, biology, and computer science, mathematics, if you, for example, work on modeling data. So what do I mean by data? And this is actually maybe more important than this general idea about cognitive neuroimaging. With data, I mean the raw data files as generated by the data recording device. Yeah. So if you have encountered data analysis in your courses, or maybe as a researcher, typically people in Germany have Siemens scanners, and there you get these DICOM files. So they are the first, they are not the raw data. The raw data, as you all know, is of course electromagnetic frequency spectrum. But the data that you as a researcher get from the machine is the reconstructed data. So essentially these is either let me find my pointer. Either these high-resolution T1 images or the functional data, which is a little bit more low-resolution. And essentially the same thing I mean for EEG data. So the raw EEG, for example, if you record with brain products, the raw EEG files that you get from the recording device. On purpose, I'm not including code, so programs in this data definition, because I assume that, or that's my approach to science, that code is shared anyway, and that we don't have data protection issues with code. We might have license issues, but that's a different field of law. We don't have data protection issues with code, unless we are really stupid and write the details of our participants into that code. So I assume that the code is shared anyway, and I also assume that any derivatives of the raw data can be reproduced based on the code. So that's why I'm also not talking about, for example, pre-processed data, some normalized data, or some statistical parametric maps, which people now share, for example, by NeuroVolt. I'm really talking about the raw data, which per participant is not really that much. So it's more to the 1 gig maybe per participant, and also for the EEG, depending on your sampling rate, it's 1 to 3 gigs. So it's still big data if you want, especially then if you have very many participants. So it's not like these are not very small files, but it's also not, it's not a terabyte or something per participant. Good. So that's what I mean by data in this case. And finally, what do I mean by open? Because there are also different interpretations, especially from open science activists, on what is meant by open. So by open, I mean the easy access to standardized data from published studies. So it shouldn't be the case that it's a lot of effort and takes a lot of time to get the data, and this will also come up in a second. The data should also be standardized. So you should not, if you share data or get data, you should not first have to go through like a year of a person working on the data and processing it in all different ways, and then you have to dig deep and so on, so it should be easy. So that's what I mean by open, but we will get more into detail about the open, of course, with the share. So why should we do that? And here I also, in this project on open neuroimaging, I somehow assume that we all agree that open science is a good thing, and I actually don't want to discuss the basic tenets of open science, whether there's a danger of being scooped on all these things. So what I think we as neuroimaging people and people working basic science is that we should share our data simply out of respect for the investment of public funding. So the most should be made out of that funding to respect the participants' investment, because after all, they go into the scanner and might feel uncomfortable and also undergo at least in MRI or also a little bit in EEG, are very, very small, but still a risk that something bad might happen to them. And a further argument as a fundamental ethical imperative is, of course, reducing these risks by having, in the long run, to acquire data from fewer participants. So these are kind of the ethical, from my perspective, ethical imperatives to make neuroimaging data available, to which degree we will have to discuss. There are, and you can view them also under ethical imperatives, but you can also just view them from a more utilitarian, we want great science for whatever reason. There are some other benefits to data sharing, and these are kind of the things that you can think of. So first of all, we have quality improvement because we increase the rate of reproducibility that we can have. We are more prone to be very rigorous in our methods. It's easier to discover errors. So if you never see the raw data by someone, then there might be errors, not even by malintent by the researcher, but simply because of errors. Cost reduction, so overall we should use less money, so decreases of redundancies when people acquire the same experiment in different settings. Interdisciplinarity is encouraged if there's not only the people actually doing cognitive neuroimaging experiments have access to the data, but also people who are more like not the experimentalists. Then, of course, there can be a hope of progress acceleration if you think in terms of meta-analysis, multi-site generalization, or in terms of power of studies, which is also a big topic. And finally, kind of sharing data is also part of the zeitgeist. So more and more funding agencies actually want you to think more about data management and data sharing. So from all of these things, what I'm basically rushing over, I'm personally of the opinion that cognitive neuroimaging has to adopt an open science standard, and I'm not the only person arguing in this direction. Of course, there are a number of people, primarily in the US, who argue in this direction. You might think this is all, so when I was at your stage, so 10 years ago, I thought that this, what I'm discussing here, would actually be a standard practice, but it wasn't, and it took quite some time for this open science idea to catch up. And you might still think this is all very reasonable and all works and should work, but then you will be also surprised to find that actually it's not happening really. So you might think that it's happening, but it's in fact not happening. But I think all these arguments are ethically and scientifically very strong, and with the open science movement also gaining more and more pace, I think now actually is the time to adopt this open science standard. And the thing is, everything is in place. So especially in cognitive neuroimaging for data sharing, the technical questions of data sharing, in my opinion, are solved. So important thing in terms of if you want to share data between different research groups is, of course, that they understand the format of other people's data, so that not a lot of time is lost when trying to understand how somebody else saved their data and what all these things that, especially in functional data, when you also have behavioral data and an experiment, if you don't have to spend a lot of time to figure out what all of this means, but if you have a standardized format. And this was proposed by essentially the Poldra group and Chris Gorgulewski in 2016. It's called the Brain Imaging Data Structure, and sounds a little bit more fancy than it is. What it is essentially a prescribed way to organize raw brain imaging data in folders. I don't think you can see this very well here. This is better, yeah. So here you can see how data looks when you get it from the scanner. So you have these numbers that index the files and DICOM, and then the brain imaging data structure proposes a specific way to organize the data over subjects. And this is there. It also exists for EEG and MEG, so there is no problem in terms of data standardization. So essentially every imaging lab should adopt this standard now. Of course, you can also say, well, I don't like the standard, I want a better standard. And so on, but you can also, because this development of bits is a kind of open science approach, you can also contribute to the standard. So if you think the standard is not optimal for your purposes, contribute and make it better. So data standardization as a technical prerequisite is solved. The same thing that maybe wasn't that solved when I started out were data repositories, because like in 2006, 2007 or so on, gigs were there, but it maybe wasn't that. So you didn't have, so for example, now you have on your Google Drive, you have 15 gig, I think, for free maybe. So that these kind of things weren't there like 10 years ago, but these days there are so many platforms to share data in different open or non-open formats. So also sharing data is possible without you having to locally invent a data repository and set up Unix server and so on, and you need to hire a technician and so on. So in principle, not in principle, but the resources to share data are now widely there. And it might even get better. So I just, when I read over the Koalitionsvertrag by CDU, CSU, SPD from this year, that's for the Germans, what they write is, wir wollen mit einer nationalen Forschungsdateninfrastruktur wissenschaftliche Datenbestände systematisieren und einen nachhaltigen Zugang sicherstellen. So stärken wir unser Wissenschaftssystem auch für den internationalen Wettbewerb. So even at this very high level, which I was quite happy when I saw that even at this very high level, where it takes a long time from the bottom to diffuse up there, it's people are aware that research data management is important and that data should be used in a sustainable manner. So, in principle, for open neuroimaging, everything is there. We have the data standard, we have the resources to share the data, but of course this argument by people who maybe are not that interested in sharing their data, that this doesn't work because of data protection issues, that's still there. Yeah. So that's then where our current project starts. So what we're trying to do is actually in a way, first-hand look into the question of data protection, so that when I argue with colleagues that we should share the data and so on, that I don't have to say, but this person said it, but that I feel confident that I actually know what's going on with data protection. up to the degree where things get into the gray areas of law and then nobody knows anymore what's going on. Yeah, and it turned out, I wasn't aware of that when I actually submitted the proposal for this project. It turns out that this is kind of a timely topic, which you might have heard about this morning as well, because just in May 2018, the new European General Data Protection Regulation comes into place. Yeah? So that's something, if you're dealing with human data, something that is readily applicable. So maybe this is a little bit redundant with what you heard this morning now, but we will go into more details according to what I hear, so bear with me. So first of all, what is this General Data Protection Regulation? It's a regulation by the EU Parliament, Council and Commission, and it's actually a law that is legally binding and applicable from May 25th, 2018. So it's starting a couple of months. There has been a transition period for the last 2 years where it was not legally binding yet, but now it's really coming into effect. And what is the basic idea behind it? This is why I have Edward Snowden here, because it's kind of the EU reaction to these global surveillance disclosures, as you all know about the NSA stuff in the US, and it's also so it tries to strengthen and unify data protection for individuals within the EU. It's especially it's driven by Germany in a way. So it tries to, so if there have been data protection laws which have not been maybe that protective of personal data, Germany tried and was in a way successful in putting its data protection ideas or imposing it on other EU countries now. So that's one aim, so to have a unification within the EU, which is of course helpful, as we will also see later with respect to data sharing. Another, in my perspective, also very important aspect is that it tries to empower the EU citizens in control of their digital data, because more and more you know that you leave digital data behind whenever you are online. So far, or me personally, I didn't really look into what happens with my data, and I've also not really feel that my digital data might be of value, and to basically make this transition for an empowered and responsible citizen, that's kind of what the General Data Protection Regulation also tries to provide. This European General Data Protection Regulation, that is just a text. It's roughly 80 pages. There are, let's say, 30 pages or so, which are really not relevant for what we have in mind here, because they are concerned with the question how, for example, member states should implement certain aspects, and how they should put measures in place that this is that the law is actually enforced. So there are maybe 50 or so pages, which are, in my opinion, actually quite readable. So it's not a text that constantly refers to other things, but there is some clear language, in my opinion, in that. So I would recommend if you are interested and are concerned with data protection in your own project, just have a read of it. The downside is a little bit, so this is applicable to Europe in general, but there are, and there will be, so there are already for Germany, country-specific regulations which have to all respect what the European stuff says, but might go a little bit, might have some small deviations here and there. And in Germany, it's even worse, because there you also have the federal law. So Berlin has maybe a slightly different data protection regulation than Brandenburg. Reading this will give you a good idea of what's going on, but you might, especially in Germany, have to look further. So why am I talking about this, and why, although I rather would do some probabilistic modeling of behavioral fMRI data, why am I also looking into it, and specifically Elena looking into it? Well, it has a clear relation to neuroimaging data sharing. So first of all, it applies to EU data collectors, processors, or subjects. So everybody in the EU has to, if you collect data or processes of our data subject, you have to respect that. The data that we acquire is personal data, according to the definition of the GDPR. So because personal data is any information relating to an individual, for example, name, address, photo, medical information, or posts, many more things. One thing here also, there's in a way a specific category which is sensitive personal data, which relates to biometric and also medical information. So the neuroimaging data falls actually into the sensitive data category. There are sanctions and fines. So if labs don't, or universities don't adhere to that, in principle, there can be sanctions and fines. They are actually quite high for the people for whom this was actually designed. So of course I didn't say that on the other slide. What they had in mind were, of course, the big internet companies, Facebook, Google, when designing this. So the fines are actually quite large because you think that Google might have a lot of money. And why is this also interesting for neuroimaging? And why does it why does it also make things tricky? Because it was designed independently of open science principles. And this is a little bit. It's quite interesting at the level of the EU. You have actually, from the funding perspective, you have a strong push towards open science. So they are actually the ones who push open science ideas much more than the state-specific funding agencies. But somehow these people in science worked a little bit independently from the people who are working on the general data protection regulation. So it does not take all problems that you might run into with open science into account. So one has to think about it and look into it. So what are the main principles? And I guess you heard about this this morning. So one principle that was quite striking for me is that the processing of personal data is prohibited by default unless consent is provided. So you need consent. Then data collection should only be done for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. So one has to talk about what are the purposes of this data collection. Then the data processing has to ensure an appropriate security. This actually is something that we also, when talking about this project, worry a little bit about, because we can argue either way, but I was not contacted by my university that the university checked that actually I'm doing everything okay. You could also argue that I should ask my university. So are we aware of the GDPR? So I don't know whether they must be in some way aware, but they definitely at our institute, or at Freie Universität, they didn't come to us and make sure that everything is fine, as they did on other institutes, as we heard last Friday. Somehow, security measures have to be taken into account. The thing is, also the data controller is responsible for GDPR compliance. That's a principle, and the data controller, we're still discussing whether it's the university or actually the research scientist, but this leaves actually the responsibility with at least us as members or representatives of the university. And finally, there is one principle in the GDPR that gives some degree of privilege for processing of personal data to science. But so there is a little bit of more is possible in science, but then this is in part underspecified, as we will see. So that kind of was the background on what the European General Data Protection Regulation is. And what we are now specifically trying to figure out is what does it say for open cognitive neuroimaging in terms of what we have to put in the consent form, how we can store the data, and how we can share the data. Yeah? So what we are trying in this project then in the end, so we are writing a paper that discusses basically what I'm telling you today, hopefully then better and in cleaner version in the summer. But we will also want to provide a consent form, which we have checked with respect to the General Data Protection Regulation and with some input, of course, also from not law lay people. Basically, my main motivation is that I want to know what do I have to from the GDPR respect for these important parts in open neuroimaging. And so I focus now a little bit on the positive sides, because you can always come up with something that is not specified, but I try to now read from the GDPR what does it specify when we talk about these terms, and I start with the consent. So what does the GDPR specify? And here you can see always where we got these things from. So there are 89 articles, and there are these recitals, which something I learned now. So recitals are basically background information that motivate certain articles in a law, Erwägungsgründe auf Deutsch. So what does the GDPR tell us for participant information and consent? So definitely the data controller's identity and contact information have to be in the participant information and the consent form. The data recipient, all the recipient categories. So if you want to share data, you have to write in, I want to share it with, and then you have to say something. Then the participant needs to be informed and then provide their consent with respect to the purpose of data processing. And that's already a problem for sharing, of course, because yes, now I'm doing this experiment where I want to figure out, I don't know, Monica, so you want to figure out whether, what are you doing? Decision making in the brain, but you had something you want to figure out. Oh no, that was your colleague. So, for example, in one experiment, you want to figure out whether the background makes a difference. Whether you can, based on EEG data, classify different categories. So that's why you're doing it. Now, what if you now want to say, okay, I want to share it, then maybe somebody wants not to work on the data because they want to figure out whether the background makes a difference for decoding what stimulus people saw, but because they are interested more in kind of the low-level features of the background. So what do you then specify in the consent form as a purpose? So do you say people are only allowed to use this for figuring out whether the background makes a difference, or do you say people are allowed to do this to study how the visual system works, or do you say people are allowed to use this or the purpose is to figure out how the brain works? This is where we will come back to that, where there's a little bit of a gray area. So how many purposes do you want to write up, and how broad can the purpose be? Because ideally we want a very broad purpose, but how broad is that allowed to be? Another thing is that participants should be allowed to restrict their consent to specific aspects. So for example, if in this example, well, my favorite example is always this, that you could think that somebody wants to use brain imaging data to study race, some things about race, so the Nazi researcher. So in principle, participants should be able to restrict their consent to say, okay, yeah, research, yes, but not that kind of research. So, and participants are actually, according to the GDPR, allowed to impose such restrictions. Specifically, if you want to share data with third countries, the intention of sharing the data, so giving it to someone else, should be specified. And specifically, if you're sharing with third countries, we will see that in a second, also risks. So this is what the GDPR actually specifies. So I can now look into a consent form. For example, there is this open brain consent form and can check, according to GDPR, are these things met? Further on, what about participant consent? So it should be an opt-in consent. So it should not be essentially that if you don't want your data to be processed or shared, then you have to click. But you have to click like Bestätigen der allgemeinen Geschäftsbedingungen that you want to. Then of course it has to be freely given. The participant consent and information should be intelligible and easily accessible, clear and plain language, and specific, informed, and unambiguous. And I think this is something one can aim for. I mean, one can aim for clear language. Also very important is that the participant information and consent need to include information about the participant rights. And these include, and here you can think, for example, if you're on Facebook, what this is for. So these include a right for data access. So you should always, and this is actually specified quite in detail, you should always be able to know what kind of data Facebook is or Google is saving from you and has at this moment. Then you have a right for data rectification. So if you say something is wrong, you should be able to correct this. For example, if your birthday is wrong or whatever. You have a right for data portability, so that means you're not only allowed to access it, but you're also allowed to have a digital copy on your own. So maybe Uli Diernagel talked about this. Did my data come up? No, then he didn't talk about it because they capitalized on that. You have a right to object. And you have a right for data erasure. And all of these rights, according to the GDPR, the subject has to be informed about. So basically on these aspects of what the GDPR specifies, we are now making sure that the consent form that we in the end will have worked on is in line with or does takes into account these points. Good. So that was what GDPR says on this thing about getting the participant's consent and informing the participant. Actually, maybe to add to that, this is of course information about the participant with regards to data protection. Yeah. So of course you should also inform the participant about what your experiment is about and so on, and whether there are any medical risks. But this is not covered here because I'm just doing this for data protection with the goggles of data protection. So what about storage? And with storage, the question of anonymization and pseudonymization becomes very important. So how should you store the data? And there, two things are, the first thing is anonymization, and there are actually two important points. So the first thing is, what does the GDPR mean by anonymous data? Well, anonymous data is information which does not relate to an identified or identifiable natural person. And it means identifiable under considerations of cost, time, technology at the time of processing, and also technological developments. If data is actually anonymous, with all these considerations in mind, then this data is not considered personal data anymore, and the GDPR does not apply. So then actually we are out of the world of the GDPR if the data is actually anonymous. Now, in my perspective, and the perspective, sorry, that I'm also imposing onto Elena, cognitive neuroimaging data cannot be anonymized because there have been now research publications on anatomical fingerprints and MRI so that you can identify participants based on their T1 images, which is, of course, very easily possible. It's like a fingerprint, your anatomy of your brain, but also functional fingerprints. So it also applies to functional data. So there has been this work on resting state MRI where people were able to recover the person, and also in EEG. So the perspective that I'm taking, and we as a lab take, is because I say what the lab has to do. No, but that one cannot tell people we are going to anonymize your data. So this is of course debatable, but the reason why I'm taking this stance is also because I want to argue with these people who don't want to do open science but say data protection, because they will always say, yeah, but you know machine learning, and then the next deep convolutional neural net that will be able to classify and figure out who that was. Yeah, and then I cannot say no, this will never happen. So taking into account these technological developments, I personally think one cannot say we will anonymize your data. One can actually say that in no academic discipline, I don't actually think this is, or no field where you're dealing with data by participants, but only there will be a positive probability that you can be identified. So in the end, we're doing with pseudonymized data is a word that I have to learn to pronounce. Pseudonymized. So the GDPR obviously is concerned with pseudonymized data. So what is pseudonymized data? It's the processing, that means also the storage of personal data in such a manner that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information, provided that such additional information is kept separately and is subject to technical and organizational measures to ensure that the personal data are not attributed to an identified or identifiable natural person, which essentially says that you have a code or a table that links your pseudonyms, for example, subject 001, you saw that in the bits, there you have subject 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, to the clear name of that person, which actually also is important if you want to, in a way, make sure that people can are guaranteed their rights, because if they later on want their data to be deleted, of course you need to figure out which data set that was. Pseudonymized data is personal data, according to the GDPR, and it can act as a safeguard. In general, the GDPR said that pseudonymization should be applied as early as possible. So ideally, if you're doing EEG or fMRI studies, you would never have kind of your own code like I used to do when I did my PhD. I had like subject 1 GD or GP or 04 DIOS or something, which maybe wasn't a good idea. And definitely now it's not a good idea anymore. And so you should essentially put the data into bits right at the very first step after getting them from the scanner. That's what they say about anonymization, pseudonymization. Data breaches is also something that I actually have not really encountered that much in my work. So of course, essentially, I think our old consent forms and everything, and what you write in a research proposal, they make sure that they write that the data is safe. Good, but the new thing that the GDPR also wants is that if there is a data breach, which is defined here, I'm not reading that out now, is that the participant and the supervisory authority must be notified. So this refers to these things that you always hear in the media, like last year or so, Yahoo got hacked and 5 billion account details were stolen 5 years ago. So they actually there's a timeline in terms of I think 3 or 5 working days, and it's mandatory. So essentially, but then there can be exemptions, and this is also like a gray area where we are not quite clear yet. Of course, this can be a lot of effort, and if the risk is very small and the effort exceeds the risk, that's what the GDPR says, then there might be an exemption, so then you don't have to do it. But the principle, so I'm always trying to feel what does the law really want to say, and I think the law really wants to say that the participant and the supervisory authority wants to be, need to be notified as soon as possible. Good. So that was about storage. So pseudonymization and data breaches. So people need to be informed about this. So what now about sharing? And here I focus on sharing between countries, because this is really annoying with data protection. So the GDPR is specific to the EU, and then there are certain approved states like Canada, Norway, New Zealand, and Faroe Islands maybe, who are approved by the European Union, and basically they are treated like GDPR states. But there are also third countries like the US, China, or Russia, with whom data sharing is by default prohibited. Yeah? Because they have different data protection laws, which might not be as strong as the German or the EU one. So the law doesn't want data to be shared there, which of course from a cognitive neuroimaging perspective is madness, because cognitive neuroimaging, it's Europe, the US and China are kind of the big contributors to this kind of science. So that makes things really difficult in terms of data sharing. But there is an exemption. I think this is actually an exemption one can work with. So the participant, in terms of the consent, needs to be explicitly informed and has to have consented to a transfer to a third country after having been informed about the possible risk. So essentially, in the consent form for cognitive neuroimaging, we will also have to say something that this data will also be shared with countries in which the GDPR does not hold, and this can potentially be risky. That's something that also needs to get in. So there are a couple of things that I already mentioned where the GDPR leaves things unspecified, and we're trying until the summer to figure out what to do with that. But then it's, we'll say a little bit about what happens if one doesn't really follow the GDPR. So what have we seen? One question is how broad the research purpose can be formulated. So the purpose needs to be explicitly and specifically formulated. But how broad can we do it for data sharing? That's a question that we're still looking into. How vague or concrete must the data recipient categories be? So do we have to say, oh, we will only share it with PIs? Does it have to be we only share it with people in research? Only with people in the lab? Another question is how we can implement the participants' right after sharing when the data is maybe not in our full control anymore. One question that we're still thinking about, maybe we will figure that out, is whether I can just as a participant say, okay, I waive all my rights, do whatever with the data, I don't care. The question is then more, do we think that is an ethical approach and do we want that? So there are some aspects that we are still struggling with and trying to work on, so stay tuned. Now, that was the second part, so that was maybe the most frontal teaching kind of facts from the law part, but I think it's also, I mean, for me, it's really helpful to be aware what the law says, because otherwise you always talk to people who say, and then also have the personal interpretation of what the law says. So that's what we cover now. So then in the essentially the last part of the talk, I want to tell you about 3 models for open cognitive neuroimaging that exist in part these days, and then actually I'm interested in what you think about it. So first, let me tell you about, or maybe first, are there any questions right now that we should look into? I haven't asked for questions, but now I'm fine. So any questions right now that we should clarify? No, everybody's asleep anyway because it's the 4th lecture. But the good thing is I'm recording it and you can watch it again and again on YouTube. Good. So what are the ways for data sharing that are currently out there? And what we're trying to do in this project is then to think about what do these ways of sharing mean for everybody, for all the stakeholders, so for everyone involved, so for participants, researchers, funding agencies, and so on, and how do they integrate into actually the law? So does that make sense from the perspective of the law? So this is what we're trying to discuss. So we have called these things, and I will tell you what I mean by them in a second. We've called these modes or models for data sharing and cognitive neuroimaging: public sharing, restricted sharing or scientific use files, and inclusive sharing, dynamic consent. So let me tell you what I mean by this. So public sharing. By public sharing, I mean a data transfer, or we mean a data transfer to an external independent data curator. So you basically upload data, your data, not your data, but the data that you acquired somewhere. And once the data is uploaded and maybe checked for consistency, there's unrestricted access to neuroimaging data, to this neuroimaging data. So when whoever goes to the website can, without registering and without providing any information, can download the data. When you download the data, there are no data use agreements whatsoever. So of course you can always make contracts with people what they are allowed to do with data. So these are called data use agreements, and these don't exist in the public sharing world. I think in a way, most successful data sharing or cognitive neuroimaging data sharing platform is OpenFMRI, and they actually work on this public sharing model. So if you navigate to OpenFMRI, you can just download some imaging data. Interestingly, there is not that much data. It's got a little bit more in like kind of the last 2 years or so. There are roughly like 90 or 100 data sets now. And they are from very specific groups. So if you think about how much neuroimaging there is and how many studies that are published, it's really just a tiny proportion of it. But it exists. It's framed as that the data is anonymized, and we discussed that. I personally think that it's not really possible. This is something I left on the slide. So they have a specific license, but I'm not talking about licensing now. So, and these are now just my thoughts, and I'm actually also interested in your thoughts. So for the public sharing, I see a number of pros. So definitely it's really easy, specifically for people who want to see data. The data access is objectively regulated. Everybody has access. Whether in the scientific community or not in the scientific community, which also leads to the next thing that there can also be non-basic research data processing. So if you're an artist and you want brain imaging data to create some art, you can use this data. Or if you are an insurance company and you try to figure out whether somebody might have kind of a chance for early onset Alzheimer, and you somehow have some additional data, then you get a certain percentage that these brains are actually from that person, and then you get a probability that there's actually early dementia onset. or you are a company who that wants to develop some new algorithms for imaging, for image analysis, and you can also do that, and then make a lot of money from data that the participants, for example, only get very little data, and the poor PhD student without any money actually had to acquire every day. So these then also, how I introduced it, leads to some cons that I see. So there are also things against it. So the data controller and the subject are not in control. Actually, if we wanted to do that, we would have to, that's not necessarily a con, but it creates an effort. We would have a comprehensive, now GDPR consistent consent to do something like this. There may be potential future data abuse because there's absolutely no control. Anonymization, pseudonymization we talked about, and this non-basic research data processing can of course be a good thing, because maybe it boosts the economy because Google has a new great algorithm. But then, of course, this might also ethically feel a little bit wrong that they make the money from the money that the person on the street had to earn. Now, so that's public sharing, and this model actually exists. So that is there, and it is there. So restricted sharing, what do I mean by that? And this is actually something that we kind of did in a recent project, essentially because of my personal ignorance of all the data protective issues, but trying to be safe in a way and just doing what I always did, and everybody always did in science. If you have a friend, and not a friend but a colleague, and this colleague asks you, you have this data, could we have a look and also work with it? You would always say yes, why not? And basically, I think one can do this very easily, but now using digital tools. And this is what I mean by this restricted sharing. So here the data controller is actually the data curator. So the person who's working on the project, they have to control and curate and make sure that the data is correct and so on, the data. And what I really mean specifically is password protected access to standardized neuroimaging data. So what I think what everybody can do, so this is now again my open science devil or angel, however you like it, what everybody can do, whoever is working in neuroimaging, can set this up and really make easy standardized neuroimaging data sharing possible. The way we are doing it is using the open science framework and using a private project. So there you essentially, if you want to have access to the data, you have to contact us and then also sign a data use agreement where we specify essentially that you are not allowed to share this data with anyone else, because otherwise this whole thing wouldn't make sense. And this is what I just said. So the data controller regulates the access. So we are doing it. That doesn't mean that I think it's the best thing or the end of the world. So I think there are some pros. So we have full control, and essentially, it's actually more the data controller who has the control, not so much the data subject, but we could, at least if the subject wants certain things, so if we have a subject and the subject or participant, and that participant says, don't share it with the Haynes lab, then this person is also in control, and we can do that. In this sense, we can also or could hope that we can minimize data abuse, because if the Nazi researcher comes and says, hello, I'm the Nazi researcher and I want to do Nazi research with it, then we say, no, that's not for Nazis. the problem with this is, of course, that we have subjectively regulated data access. So this is then, well, that's good. And here I'm having it as a good, but I also have it as a con in a second, because it also means that if I think Radek has enough data, then I could think maybe I don't, although I'm sharing in principle, I don't want to share with this specific researcher, which I think is not in the spirit of open science. So I also see as a con. And of course, yeah, now I'm switching a little bit back and forth, but the data recipient also has some responsibilities. So they have a data use agreement, they have to think about it, and this also means there's some effort involved. So definitely the effort is much more in this way, so that you have to first contact someone, then read through this data agreement and then sign it, and then also enforce it. So that it's not that easy. It's still quite easy, but not as easy as public sharing. Now, so these are things that exist now, and personally, right now, I'm a little bit on the restricted sharing side, because the public sharing is pushed by the US, where they have data regulations that are not as strict as the European ones, and I feel that at least with the restricted sharing, I'm trying to be safe and be in line with the law, while also trying to do a little bit of open science. Although it's of course still that I decide who gets to see the data. So ideally, and this is now I think future stuff, is what I personally currently think would be a nice thing is what we call inclusive sharing, or Elena called inclusive sharing, or dynamic consent. So what do we mean by this? So first, the data is again transferred to an external independent data curator, so we don't want to deal with it. Actually, I don't want to deal with this whole data protection stuff, and I also don't want to deal with regulating the access and so on. So it should be a third party. But then the data access should be somewhat protected. And people should have clearly registration and data use, and also sign data use agreements. Why? Not because I want to have it restricted, but what I essentially, and this is the crucial thing, is that the data subject, so the participant, they should be in charge of their data. So they should ideally automatically, once somebody wants to analyze their data for whatever purpose, they should be able to say, okay, this is fine or this is not fine. Of course, one can also, maybe one does not need to do this for every reanalysis of the data that somebody wants to do. Maybe one can also here use a little bit of an opt-out agreement, but there should be some possibility for opt-out, which does not exist really in the public data sharing, because there's no control whatsoever. There should be control so that participants, once, like in 10 years or so, when it becomes clear that from these brain images you can do all crazy bad things, participants should be able to say, no, I don't want my data to be shared anymore. So an example for this is this My Data project, which I guess then really DNR has not discussed. So they use this right for data portability for exactly this, where essentially the participants then actively give the data to researchers. And I think what's nice about this inclusive sharing and dynamic consent, well, that's on the next slide, is that it actually is in line with this GDPR, and I also think in line with what's happening in the world. So the participant is really empowered, so they are in control of their data. It's still not completely uncontrolled, so potential data abuse is minimized. And which I also see as a pro, the responsibilities for us as researchers is minimized. We don't have to take care of everything, but the participant is in charge, and I think the participant should be in charge. Of course, this needs informed and understanding participants, so there's some work to do. And so a con right now is that it definitely needs new technical infrastructure. So I am not aware of anything like this existing. So like where all of this, so that it's protected and participants can re-engage and control what they do with what is being done with their data, are really in control of that. Good. So I will skip the example, which is maybe I just show you this briefly. So in terms of putting, just to encourage you, in terms of standardizing data into bits format and then uploading it as a protected or private project onto OSF is no problem. We have done it, so you can as well. So everybody do it. You can find more details on this project, of course, on our website. There's a preprint. Maybe as just a side remark, when we submitted this, actually the journals, they also have specific data protection regulations. So there was an additional, so we submitted that to scientific data. So there was an additional step where the reviewers actually signed that they can be assigned to our project and see our project, but we don't get their name because Nature doesn't want clear name reviews. So be prepared for some hiccups in the process. But yeah, let's now stop this, and we can have a poll after that. Let's see. I think I still want to record it, because if I have recorded it, then then I have some data that I can tell somebody else about. So now I actually want to ask you as the audience, after I discuss things and pros and cons, to see what you actually think. And so now go again to menti.com. And that's the red bar, and enter the code, and let's see what you say. So whether I biased you enough or not. Let's see what happens. So I guess I'll wait for. So they sell this actually. It's an app. So I got 2 presentations for free. So what I've done so far is for free, but one can actually buy an account on this, and I wonder whether it's actually necessary. But it's a little bit of fun. So what do we see? Public sharing. I discouraged you. Restricted sharing. There are a lot of people who are, maybe not.
I'm sorry. I can't see the numbers, the code. My eyesight isn't that good. So.
So the code is 348536. Yeah. Anonymous data. Okay, so seems I biased you a lot. So the restricted sharing is actually quite popular. I also want to try this because we can. Here you can actually type something. And there is a profanity filter, which I didn't turn on. So maybe let's see whether this works as to start the discussion. So has anyone submitted something there? Because then it might not work. Okay, so there you can write something like, but what about something? And then it should pop up here. Any question? It's the same code, but doesn't go on. You might be able to on. Okay, if that doesn't work, let's just skip it. So I'm asking you now. So there were a lot of people who were not convinced by my inclusive sharing. I'm really interested in why you're not convinced by the inclusive sharing. So why do you prefer restricted sharing? Somebody tell me.
Because I think that not all subjects will respond. I don't know how the system works. Probably, I don't know, they get an email and then they have to like consent, and probably many subjects will not reply. I don't know over how much time this will go. Probably the study is published, I don't know, 2 years after the experiment, then people already forgot about it, or it's in spam folder, and then you have some sort of dropout for the person who reanalyzes the data.
Yeah, I agree, but you are, so what did you vote for, the public sharing or the restricted sharing? Okay. Yeah, actually I see this point in terms of this is actually maybe as another side note. When we uploaded this paper onto bioRxiv with this restricted sharing mode, actually Russ Poldrack sent an email and asked whether we don't want to put it in open FMI, and then we discussed a little bit via email. He actually made exactly the same point. So that first of all, it's a lot of administrative overhead, and then of course there will be. It sounds like a nightmare. And I agree. It sounds a little bit like a nightmare. There will be dropout. So this is, in a way, I see this as a. It might actually make more sense if you're talking about these really big studies. So if you're talking about these 1,000 connectomes and so on, where the dropout is maybe a little bit negligible. There will be dropout. Maybe this can be addressed by like a opt-out response. So what I somehow, but how would you empower a participant to at one point, because I'm thinking into the future, at one point there will be, Google DeepMind will take over the world. And at that point, people might want to not have the data shared anymore. So how would you implement this then? So that is kind of dynamic. This is what I mean by dynamic, so that people can, for some time, do something, but then they change their mind because of new developments. How would you do that? I mean, of course, they can just send me an email and say, don't share my data anymore in the restricted sharing. But
maybe I was thinking maybe you could also give people the option whether they want to be asked to give consent or not. But then it will get kind of messy because some data will be uploaded on the inclusive sharing platform and the other data on the other one. I'm not sure. And also I feel like many people are very worried about their privacy, but on the other hand, everyone's kind of overwhelmed with the amount of emails and accounts to overview and coordinate. So I don't know what subjects in general would behave like.
Yeah, I also don't know. And it needs, but yeah, any other ideas or for those people who don't like inclusive sharing, is there another argument not to do that besides that it's effort for?
Yeah, for me it's the delegating responsibility, the full responsibility to the subject. I think many laymen will not understand the goal of the research. So I think the researcher who knows better should have some shared responsibility.
Yeah, I agree in a way, but then I also think specifically also with what the EU is trying to do with open science is actually to make or render the participants and the lay persons more responsible. So I agree in the sense that, so I think it would be then the task for the researcher in a way to really be able to make clear to the participant what is actually going on, so that you have like a responsible participant and you are not the kind of person who decides for other people. So but that's my. So I've heard that in this argument, and so this I think starts a little bit from different kind of mentioned. And so I also, with respect to the dropout, get an argument that, yeah, maybe then people just drop out because they want to annoy science and so on, and then just so. But yeah, so the way we argue here, the way I think about it is that I think of humans as very responsible, very informed, empowered people, and that's kind of where I can see this working. But because I don't feel like I should be patronizing people, except my students. I think, but yeah, but it's hard. I mean, it's kind of it's the same question in terms of open science, how you can actually have valuable outreach. So how can you really explain to people what you're doing?
On the same notion, what about patients who have neurodegenerative diseases and progressively develop maybe dementia? Maybe they are able to consent in the beginning, but after a while, if they still want to use the data, how can you make sure that the patient understands what you want to do? And if not, if they don't understand, then you have to take in like relatives or family members, and it makes it all much more difficult.
It definitely makes it more difficult. Here, of course, we are thinking. So you're right. So I was explicitly thinking of non-patients as the participants, so people who are healthy when the data is acquired. But of course, everyone could later on develop a disease. And then I think again even worse. I mean, at one point they might also die. And then you're right. So what happens then? Either if the participant is not able to really convey their will anymore, or if they are dead, what happens with the data? And again, there I think actually this is kind of the progress or the process that society is in right now, that these questions come up more and more with respect to any digital data. So I don't know whether you know that. I have to stop. So. Okay, so maybe let me just finish. I thought it was like, stop now. Facebook just started this kind of that you can, that you can determine who gets access to your profile once you're dead and who regulates that. So that basically, I'm missing the English word, sorry. So Erbrecht for digital data is becoming more important. And this also, I mean, definitely, I mean, this, but also what you describe in terms of the consent. If people develop neurodegenerative diseases in the course of their life, the question is also who is responsible for their Facebook data, not only for these kind of data. But there was a comment.
Actually, I don't remember the details, but I thought actually last year it was discussed to change the law specifically for dementia research, that it's possible to opt in before dementia onset, and that the consent there would remain in some way. So I think actually for this specific case, Germany tried to adjust the law so that research on dementia becomes easier.
Yeah.
But does it only apply specifically to dementia research, or does it also apply to, for example, if you have deep brain stimulation?
I think at the time what I remember from the debate was that it was specific for dementia research.
Yeah, because there's so many other diseases that eventually might develop dementia of some kind. And you might want to study something else that
Another thing that I'm interested in now, only 2 people were in favor of public sharing, so there seems to be some concern about this public sharing, although it's the current actually working mode in cognitive neuroimaging, if people actually share their data. And I wonder whether you have any arguments against public sharing that I did not mention. I mean, I didn't really mention explicit ones, but did I forget anything that where public sharing can go wrong? Or maybe asked another way, I'm just interested. So, who is worried about potential future data abuse? Who was motivated to be against? So, or what are your reasons against public data sharing? Can somebody tell me why don't you like public data sharing?
So, based on what you told in the second part, I think I would mostly be worried that I would get into some sort of conflict with the law, like sharing data. I wouldn't be worried myself if someone uploaded my brain data.
Okay. So, is this the consensus? So, is there uncertainty about? So, who is worried about the lawfulness of public sharing? It's not the majority. But what are you? Why don't you like public sharing?
Can I say something as one of the few people who actually voted for public sharing?
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, let's go progressive. The ethics are changing. The privacy, the idea of privacy that we have right now have changed from so far away to now. Like that was once a time when the marriage is not accessible. You have to marry who your father is pointing you to. Now we have free love and free relationships. And we have people coming out closet. Sexuality has become now an issue. And maybe in the future, it might be able to say that, oh, you have you have a decreased response in your anterior ciliary cortex to some stimuli. You're so brave. Maybe that's another type of thing in the future. I think we have to keep a future perspective when we are looking at this kind of storage, because this is meant for the future. We are storing our data so that the future students can learn from us. The future scientists can actually learn from our experiences, whether it's failure or success. So that's my argument for public sharing. We should make it. We should keep it in the sense that we should not worry so much about I think that I'm making a very big statement here. We should not worry so much about the ethics, about the current opinion at the moment, and try to prepare for what's coming in the future.
Very good. So, but there's a argument against.
Yeah. So for me, it's a little bit in the other direction, not in the other direction, but I think that actually we shouldn't push subjects or participants to consent into something and then just throw the data out there. That's why I voted for inclusive sharing, because I think that they still should be able to retreat from their decision later on, because sometimes people come to the lab and they get all those forms and they read them and they sign them, but at some moment in time they might realize, okay, well, that's not what I wanted to do. And I just think that's also like an issue for us. I mean, of course, I'm all up for open data and open science and sharing the data. But I think that people might even be more willing to share their data if they have the possibility to get out of it again, and that they don't share for a lifetime of having the data out there.
Yeah.
Follow-up issue to that, because I largely agree, but to the point where I think if we ourselves, or maybe you as an expert, still cannot foresee the consequences public sharing can have on an individual, we shouldn't ask of participants or patients to agree to something that we can't foresee the consequences of. And
Yeah, I think, in the end, it's an ethical question that everybody has to figure out for themselves. But I also, I was in favor of public sharing basically all the time, because I thought, where is brain imaging data and so on. And I'm also, I like that you actually made a case for it, and also, taking into account parallel developments. I think it's maybe a little bit of a cultural issue. Of course, Germany is very worried about this, and also has, history-wise, of course, reason to do so. And it's also might actually also depend on what television show you just watched, because when I watched Black Mirror, I was more going towards the inclusive sharing. But I also agree that things are changing, and then it's essentially whether you want to be safe or you want to be progressive. I don't know. So I think what we will argue for is this inclusive sharing, and then I might try as a follow-up project. This is actually what my last slide, also to come to an end a little bit, is about. So I think we might try to explore, once we are really finished with this project, try to explore a little bit more how such dynamic consent can be implemented and how tricky it really gets, because we don't want to make things overly complex. But there is German angst, and there is the data protection law. So this is what we want to follow up. But I think in the end, it's essentially an issue that will, or a question that will go on for the next decade, I guess, how we are dealing with these data, and what this is a little bit about is kind of to have an additional perspective in the neuroimaging field, because right now it's really the public sharing that is dominating, or at least the publications are dominated by that in cognitive neuroimaging, because they're pushing it. And so I don't know, but it's something that one can discuss and which doesn't need formulas. So that's also good for me. Then I get more feedback.
One question, because at the beginning of the talk, you were saying your motivation was that you read this paper and you would like to do something with the data to check that. And as I guess more and more data does become available, do you actually do that? How often does it happen that you actually go after reading a paper and get the data? Is that a realistic scenario?
For me, it's depends, but where it's very realistic is when I'm a reviewer, because when I'm a reviewer now, I constantly tell people to make their code available and also their data. And ideally, as a reviewer, I would first of all like to see the code, because from just looking at the code, you get a feeling how tedious and how clean and how structured people were working on something. And then, of course, ideally, I would, as a reviewer, be able to check what the people did based on having the data set and reproducing the analysis, because then I can say, this is what the analysis does. So I agree, and this is also something what comes up, that maybe not the case that after a publication, but that depends on, I guess, also on the publication. If it's like a high profile thing, then maybe more people want to reproduce that. But as a reviewer, actually, I think this is something that is also very important. Because I never know. I mean, it's especially in fMRI, you read these descriptions of what people, how they did their analysis, and you don't understand it. You don't see the code, and you are asked to say whether this is methodological fine work. So this is definitely somewhere where I want to see it.
It's not just neuroimaging, but there are also huge databases regarding genome and transcriptome and other things like that. And I think there it happens in the problem that you want to reanalyze the data to find, do some genome-wide association studies and stuff like that, where you want to have large data sets, and it's very costly, so you can't afford to, sequence 100 patients, so you want to have a database, and it has to be open, but it's better, it's open, than more and more scientists can do, reanalyze the data without doing those experiments again, which is really costly and don't really make sense to do those in such large numbers. But I guess it applies to the same laws.
Maybe also to add to what I just said. So the one thing is also this power discussion right now in fMRI, and I think if all the fMRI data, for example, that was acquired from, the late 90s to now, would be shared in a standardized way, then one could, in terms of these meta-analysis and reanalysis, could actually get this power issue out of the way and maybe see a little bit more clearly what the activations are in all of this studies, so pooled over different studies. So I think there are specific projects where, especially with regards to pooling, where this would be helpful. Just something I forgot. Good. I'm very happy. I hope you are all happy as well, so I can talk on you. Is there anything that you want to discuss? Otherwise, I think we worked hard and can stop here. So, thank you. And have fun with the remaining stuff.
We have a little bit of time before the keynote, so time for 20 minutes, toilet break or whatever, some fresh air, and then I hope to see you all back here. Thank you.